First of all, I want to thank you for allocating capital so well all these years. Very much appreciated. The question has to do with housing and housing reform more specifically. There's clearly legislation in Washington, D.C. right now talking about reforming the GSEs, specifically Fannie and Freddie. Do you think we need housing reform? What would be a reasonable approach to do it? And if private participants were involved, would that make sense for Berkshire, given Ajit's actuarial skills and your ability to allocate capital?
Well, I think that, and Charlie may disagree with that, I think that the 30-year fixed rate mortgage is a terrific boon to home owners. It's not necessarily such a great instrument to own as an investor, but I think it's done a lot for home ownership. It may have been abused in some cases, but overall it's done a terrific job for home ownership in the country. Let people get into homes earlier than they might have been able to otherwise, kept costs down to quite a degree. And so I would hope that, and the government guarantee part of it does keep the cost down. No private organizations can do it. I mean, the home mortgages are an $11 trillion or so market, and there's not the insurance capacity, or remotely the insurance capacity, for private industry to do the job, and the rates would be much higher. So I think you keep the government in the picture. Now the question is how you keep the government in the picture without keeping politics in the picture. We found some of the problems with that in terms of not only Fannie and Freddie doing a lot of dumb things on their own, but being prodded into doing some of those things by politicians. And I think there could be a way. I wrote an article 20 or 30 years, probably 30 years ago, an op-ed piece that appeared, I think, in the Washington Post, when the FDI, well, when FSLIC, the savings and loan guarantee operation, was essentially falling apart, and suggesting for the FDIC some way to get the private sector into pricing and evaluating the risk, in that case of banks, but essentially the government being the main insurer. There could well be a way such that model, and it's being explored now, that model works in terms of home mortgage insurance. I don't think we would likely be a player, because I think that other people would be more optimistic than we would be in setting rates. In the end, the government would have to be the main insurer. I mean, you might have a situation where private industry priced 5% of it, and the government took the other 95%, and in turn even guaranteed the 5% by the private industry once the private investors went broke. But I do think it's very important to get housing, the mortgages for homes, to get that a correct national policy. And I know it's being worked on, and I think it's very unlikely that Berkshire Hathaway would play any part in it. Charlie, what are your thoughts?
Well, when private industry was allowed to take over pretty much the whole field, we got the biggest bunch of thieves and idiots that you can imagine, screwing up the whole system and threatening all of us. So I'm not very trustful of private industry in this field. And so much as I hate what politicians frequently do, I think the existing system is probably pretty sound. At the moment, Fannie and Freddie are being pretty conservative, and they're making almost all the home loans. I think that's okay. And I'm not anxious to go back to where the investment banks were in a big race to the bottom in terms of creating phony securities.
Yeah, and think one question is whether you let Fannie and Freddie just run off as is, and
I let them keep doing just what they're doing.
But I think certainly one of the things that led Fannie and Freddie astray was the desire to serve two masters and increase earnings in double-digit ranges. And to do that, they started doing big portfolio activities. I think if Freddie and Fannie had stuck to insuring mortgages and not become the biggest hedge funds in the country, because they did have this capability of borrowing very cheap, very long, and therefore could get what looked like a reasonable spread on a huge portfolio action. I think that was a big contributing factor to the downfall.
They became, in effect, private corporations, but they're not anymore, Warren. And they are, at the moment, being fairly conservative.
There are people that want to return to being private corporations, though.
Yes, but I think that's a mistake, because when they really got lousy, it's because the private companies were taking over the whole mortgage market as bad lending drove out good, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to hold up their volumes, joined in the rush to laxity and fraud and folly. And so
would you let them have portfolio activities at all?
I don't see any need for it.
Yeah, I don't either. And I think that did get them in quite a bit of trouble. And I think those were done in order to keep the earnings per share game going.
No, I think that particular experiment in privatization was a total failure.
Okay. Station 11.
And we made $1 billion out of it, if you remember.
Well, I wasn't going to mention that.